Hello and welcome back to the Uncorked podcast. My name is Brian, and we are back with another episode here today, and it is a much anticipated one, at least for myself. A couple of you on the comments on my YouTube channel have indicated this is an anticipated episode for you all as well, or at least some of you. And what am I talking about? Well, for the last 2 to 3 months, I have done 12 reviews over on Whiskey Uncorked on YouTube of 18-year-old core range mostly, other than one, 18-year-old core range single malt Scotch whiskeys. And what's the big deal with that, you may say? Well, it was a pretty big gap in just my Scotch whiskey knowledge and experience. And once I started up this channel, I think one thing that became acutely aware to me, at least, are all the things that I didn't know, or all the things I wasn't sure of, all of the biases that I had kind of just absorbed and took other people's words for it, that sort of thing. Basically, since the start of the channel back end of November of last year, when I first posted a video here, I've been trying to tackle some of those things so that going forward, I can more intelligently discuss whiskey in general, globally, not just Scotch whiskey, but basically everything. And I can't learn everything all at once, and some things take time. I spent very early on in my channel looking at biases and that sort of thing. Very seems like a long time ago. It's a very I wouldn't do what I did again, but sometimes you just got to go where your heart takes you, I suppose. But I decided that one pretty big gap was this 18-year-old kind of core range category for Scotch. And why is that? Well, I had skipped, well, why did that gap exist? Let's tackle that first. You know, there was bourbon and Scotch and everything that I was pretty committed to being into just about everything when I first really took the deep dive into whiskey. And elevated from more than just kind of a casual drinker who was still learning to enjoy whiskey neat and all that sort of thing, but had gotten to that point where I was able to, and then that escalating to a passion, a hobby, that sort of thing. But there was a point where I switched to Scotch. I've talked about that before. Well, I didn't switch, but my focus became more Scotch. I still love my bourbon, but I started off with Scotch, probably like most people do. And that's tackling the kind of the 10, 12-year-old introductory. I don't like the term entry level because some of those whiskeys I don't believe are true. You know, they can be entry level, but I think it's being rude to the whiskeys. They are introductions to brands, generally speaking, or to distilleries. And learned to enjoy those quite a bit. And probably because of my continued enjoyment of bourbon, jumped pretty much right into the independent bottling and special release world of Scotch whiskey. Going for the higher ABVs to a certain degree, some higher age statements as well. But I basically said, okay, the 18-year-old single malt Scotch whiskeys, the 46% on chill filtered natural color stuff, all that costs X, $100, $150 a bottle, whatever. There's a lot to buy at that price point. There are a lot of options if you're willing to spend $150 on a bottle of alcohol. And I just kind of went all in on the special releases and chasing down spring banks and things like that. So it was really this thing I had ignored outside of a few bottles here and there, two of which I have sitting right in front of me. I might take a little break at one point here and just do a quick side-by-side. What I have here are two whiskeys I did not review on the channel. I won't do a full-on review of them here today, but I have two samples that I have saved from bottles that I had previously of the Aaron 18-year-old. One was the pre-rebrand. It looks like the new one that I have, the post-rebrand, I have a date of August 28th, 2020 on here. I'm sure that's the bottling date. And so this other one would have been before that. Looks like I bought this one sometime in 2021 as well. I'm not sure when it was bottled, but anyways, poured these two out, dug these out of my sample stash, and maybe we'll take a look at them just to kind of continue the theme here. Anyways, to kind of get back on track, I did these 12 reviews over basically one per week. Some of them were longer, a half hour long. I was talking about some of the industry issues, some of the where it fits in the bigger picture sort of conversations. Tackled a lot of value conversations, that sort of thing. And so at some point along the way, I decided that it was going to be necessary for me to kind of take a retrospective, a look back at kind of what I've learned over the last 3 months and how maybe this whole thing has affected how I view Scotch whiskey or how it hasn't, and maybe how it's going to affect how I speak about it, how I go about purchasing it in the future, et cetera, et cetera. Just kind of take some time to summarize my own experience, even if it's just for myself. And since I have a YouTube channel, well, might as well throw it out there for all of you. You've been along with the journey if you've been following me. If not, I'll have a playlist created just for this series, hopefully, so you can just click on it and watch it as you see fit if you want. But why don't we start this whole thing off by just kind of reviewing what bottles I reviewed, scores I gave them, and then kind of jump off from there just as a refresher for everyone. Or if you're listening on a podcast network or something, you're not familiar with my YouTube channel, at least you'll have a baseline for what we're talking about here. So I started the whole thing off by reviewing the Anok 18 from the Nakdu distillery. I started out giving that one an 8, and I just finished that bottle a week or two ago. I think it deserved the 8. The last couple pours were really good, and it was like, okay, yeah, I think the 8 was deserved. Maybe a bit of a low 8, but 8 on my scoring scale is excellent, and it was a very good bottle of whiskey. Probably one of those. Nakdu is a worm tub distillery, I believe, and I do thoroughly enjoy my worm tub distilleries, although they can be pretty different across the board regardless. But Anok 18, that was a nice bottle for sure. I enjoyed drinking the rest of that bottle quite a bit. So I got an 8 out of 10. I followed that up with the brand new Bruichladdich 18. It was closer to brand new, obviously, when I reviewed it. And gave that an 8 as well, although I did state that I felt that is something that could open up further, and that by the end of the bottle, I may bump that up to a 9, possibly. That's possible with many of these, but definitely really enjoyed the Bruichladdich 18. I know there was a little bit of a torn opinion on it, but I'm a Bruichladdich fanboy, so take my bias for what it is. Follow that up anyways with the Glenmurray 18, one of the quote-unquote budget bottles. Gave that a 7. I did really enjoy that. I know it kind of gets some of the other reviews I've seen of it say that, it's a little boring, a little straightforward. I can understand where they're coming from, but I think it's really nice. Now, when I bought this, it was $90 plus tax, and that's a fantastic deal for an 18-year-old whiskey. You don't really see 18-year-old age statements even on blended scotch for under $100. That has since, at least the store that I bought it from, the Total Wine, within a couple months, they must have got another shipment in, and it was $105. So it went up a whole $15, which is a pretty big chunk percentage-wise. But I guess it's still technically one of the cheaper 18-year-old whiskeys out there. Again, I still enjoy it. I don't include price in my scores. Again, if I've mentioned that a million times, but just want to make that clear for anyone new listening out there. So my score wouldn't necessarily change with the price increase, but just know not quite as good of a value as it was earlier this year, at least for me. So up next, I did a review of the Tomatin 18. Enjoyed that one, gave that one a 7 as well. 7, maybe I've mentioned, is very good on my scale. Expected to maybe like that one a little bit more. Maybe that's one that will open up for me. I had it before and liked it quite a bit, but I guess, sherry is a little hit or miss for me. Either I really, really love it, or it's maybe a little middle of the road. I would definitely put Tomatin a little bit above middle of the road. I mean, 7 is a very good score for me, so probably enjoyed it about as much as I did the Glenmurray, maybe a little more. I think that video is where I kind of talked about, given that it isn't a cheap bottle, it's definitely not as good of a value as the Glenmorangie, at least in terms of just overall pricing. But there's some other alternatives out there. I think I referenced you could get a Speyburn 15 and a Bunnahabhain 12 for the same price as a Tomaten 18. You'd have to watch that video to kind of just get my entire opinion on that. It's an interesting question when you start comparing these more expensive bottles and like, what can you get? What else can you get, as I mentioned earlier, for that same price tag? And that's kind of the issue I think people run into sometimes with these 18-year-olds in 2024. But let's move on. Up next, I reviewed the Deanston 18. It's a new bottle that I had picked up relatively recently. Had to order it from overseas. Really enjoyed that one. Gave it an 8 for the time being. Again, these are all the first time I've had these bottles, and most of these reviews, I was only a third of the way, quarter of the way into the bottles by the time I reviewed them. So we'll see next year. By this time next year, maybe I'll have a higher or lower opinion. Maybe we'll do a check-in episode or something at that point. But Deanston 18, gave that one an 8 out of 10. Really, really enjoyed that. Then we followed up with Springbake 18, which I gave a 9. Absolutely loved that version of Springbake 18. I know a couple of you commented that the 07/01/20 bottling date, that version wasn't necessarily your favorite, but it definitely is one of mine. So definitely standing by that 9 out of 10 on that one. It's still one of my favorite bottles on my shelf right now. And then one of the bigger surprises of really the last year, just generally, is the Altmore 18. I picked that up a while back, opened it last year, and almost immediately I was very, very surprised by how much I love that one. So gave it an 8 out of 10, not quite 9 territory, but pretty close. Then Bunnahabhain 18, I gave that one an 8. Followed that up with the Talisker 18, which got the lowest score. I gave that a 5 out of 10, which is average. That's an average score. I don't particularly connect with Talisker all that much. It's kind of been an up and down thing for me, and it's been mostly down lately. It's just, for whatever reason, there's something that just doesn't agree with my palate, and I think I remember saying that there's like some there's some empty spots in the flavor profile. It just feels, maybe that's what people mean when they refer to a whiskey being brittle. Like, it just feels like it's just too fragile, it's too thin. It's just missing. There's something missing from it. And anyway, I have some other suspicions as to why I don't like Talisker that much as well, but that's another video. Moving along, I did do a Long Row 18 as well. A bottle I picked up for a decent-ish price on auction a while back. Really enjoyed that. A bottle that changed a lot for me from the time I opened it to the time I reviewed it. Gave that one an 8 as well. Although that is definitely a tentative score. I think that's Springbank in general. Anything out of that distillery tends to take some time for the bottle to kind of completely show itself. So we'll see. That's another one we'll have to check back in on, but I gave that an 8 out of 10. The Lechik 18, I gave a 9 out of 10, the second 9 in the series. I expected to like the Lechik 18, but I don't know, it was just something I fell in love with like almost immediately. And I just really enjoyed drinking it. It was similar to the Altmore 18 in that regard, but it just had the peat gave it a little extra oomph, I guess. I think I had debated giving the Altmore a 9, but thought that maybe that was me being a little overexcited. But the Lechik 18, I was in the mood that day of just saying, nope, I'm totally on board with this one. 9 out of 10. Excellent. 9 is wow. With 10 is stunning, by the way. I do have like specific descriptions of these scores, which probably need a little bit of a refresh, but we'll talk about that later. Another episode there as well. And then I wrapped everything up, not this week, but the week prior, with the one bottle that isn't core range, but the new Port Charlotte 18 limited release from earlier this year. Really enjoyed that one as well. Gave that an 8 out of 10. Some very complex flavors that work really well together. Obviously, this one has the possibility of probably increasing as well. I don't see too many of these decreasing. Maybe something like the Glen Murray, but I feel that a lot of these bottles are going to open up, and I'm going to get to know them better. And probably by the time they're gone, I will have even higher opinions of some of these at least. So anyways, that's the 12 bottles that I reviewed for this series. I'm now ready-ish to jump on and just kind of talk about my reflections and my opinions and maybe a couple other topics that have come to mind over the course of this whole series. But before we do that, why don't I at least get my nose in these two Isle of Arrans, these two 18-year-olds, and see if my opinion of them from previous holds up. So obviously the old 18, that version was discontinued with the release of this new 18. The new 18 is currently on hopefully temporary hiatus, currently replaced with the 17-year-old edition. Hopefully the 18-year-old comes back. I haven't tried the 17. They definitely probably put a bit of a more of a premium price on the 17. I don't know, maybe that's just because stock is pretty limited and they want to make sure that that 17-year-old sticks around until they catch back up with the 18-year-old. Who knows? I'm not sure, but the 18-year-old was at least reasonably-ish priced here in the States. I think it was a little better deal elsewhere, but it was definitely had a little bit of a premium on it here. But really, really enjoyed the new 18-year-old. The old one at the time when I was going through this bottle, I felt like it was a little, maybe more like the Glen Murray, a little bland, that it wasn't really doing anything super different or interesting. But this was years ago, so my palate probably has grown to appreciate some different flavors. But why don't we take a quick look at these two before we get into the whole actual retro? All right, let's see the old one first. So probably about what I remember, pretty malt forward. Some fruitiness, some apples, some orchard fruits, maybe a little bit of citrus. I think there is a little bit of sherry in here for sure, but it's pretty light. Maybe a slight nuttiness. Again, I don't want to take too much time. I'm not going to do full reviews here. Don't want to drag this out too long. I'm probably going to cut out the breaks just to kind of keep everything a little bit tighter. So if it feels like I'm going through these real quickly, that's why I'm just cutting out the pauses. But here's the new one. Yeah, a lot deeper. The fruitiness is much different. A little bit more tropical fruit, dried red fruits. Some nuttiness. It's pretty heavily sherried, but it doesn't smell to me like a sherry bomb. This is more similar in nature, at least on the nose, and I know on the palate as well, to like the Craigellachie 19 that I just put a review up for, the Exceptional Cast series. It's obviously sherried, but it's not a sherry bomb. The sherry qualities are really integrated. I really love the fruit quality on that Craigellachie, and the 18 was always the same way for me from Arran, and I'm getting the same thing right now as well. Definitely like the nose on the new 18 a little bit better, but the old 18 is still pretty enjoyable. All right, so before I actually taste these, why don't I talk a little bit more about why I did this? What was I trying to get out of this whole series? I've already kind of talked about some of it, but there's this gap in my knowledge, and obviously I want to make sure that I can have the conversations that need to be had with the community that I was going to be attempting to build up to some degree here. And it's still pretty early on in all of that. But as I mentioned, once you start a channel, you kind of want to know everything, and it's okay if you're learning on the fly. I think, especially if you're just putting it out there, I think that's interesting for people. They get to participate. You guys have given me feedback about bottles that you think I would like, or whether you disagree with me or agree with me on certain things. And that's great. It's all about conversation, right? And I guess that's a good segue just into, I'm still in the learning phases of not just this category of whiskey, but just in general. So a lot of the things that I'm going to say, these are what I'm thinking right now. These aren't like, I'm not putting a stake in the ground, drawing a line in the sand, saying this is what I believe. This is kind of just what I'm thinking at the moment, at this point in time, things I'm pondering, and we'll see. We'll see if over time those things stick or if they change a little bit. But I'm just kind of putting my thoughts out into the universe, so to speak. So in terms of filling this gap, just in my own knowledge and wanting to connect with more people, because obviously the core range bottles are things that more people are drinking and can share and we can converse about. It's a little bit more difficult when it comes to like independent bottlings or even some, pretty limited special releases, that kind of thing. So I felt it was probably pretty important that I didn't completely ignore this, since 18-year-old Scotch malt whiskeys are still obtainable. Again, not for everybody. We'll talk about that more so here. It's getting harder for people to participate here. But I needed to know how I was going to talk about this category in the future, how I was going to view it from a value perspective and pricing perspective, right? That's been a big point of all of this. And then obviously getting feedback, like what are the people who are watching my channel thinking about the 18-year-old category? And generally speaking, it's been pretty positive. Obviously, I've gotten some comments saying like, used to love them, can't justify it anymore. Some people who, maybe seemed like they were actively pretty annoyed at the entire situation. And there's going to be a whole gamut of opinions and budgets and perspective on value. And we'll talk about some of that stuff here today. But I guess the original purpose to kind of sum all of that up was, I wanted to explore this kind of price to quality equation for this pretty distinctive category of single malts. Obviously, the prices for everything have been increasing. The prices for Scotch have been going up. Bourbon, everything's increasing, right? Cost of production is going up. There's this boom, supply and demand, the whole thing. But it kind of felt like that pricing curve was kind of starting to become a more exponential, right? And once you get that 15-year-old age statement, and then you get to the 18, right? It's just going up, 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 and then it starts to really kind of go vertical. And that was creating, I think, what I've termed just as an inflection point in just the community, right? Because it is becoming this divide with every year of age on these that's stated on the bottles. Every year costs more the more you go up, right? So you're getting up to those 25-year-old bottles of single malts. So I'm talking primarily official bottlings, but obviously the independent bottlings are affected as well. And once you get up to that 25-year-old age statement, like the options for the vast majority of people have become extremely limited. I think you have like the Annoc 24, which is still at least somewhat justifiable. I know prices range drastically. It still seems to be something that you can pick up in the States here for $250. It's not sitting everywhere, but it's somewhere in that kind of price range. So if you can get it for that price, it's probably one of the cheaper 24-year-olds out there, and it's pretty damn good as well. I haven't owned a bottle myself. I definitely probably should grab one, but I always had other priorities, I guess, as I've mentioned. But yeah, so we're exploring this price to quality equation, like what's worth what, at least for me personally, and then obviously give everyone the chance to respond. But it does feel like the online, at least the online Scotch whiskey community, right, is kind of getting segmented, and a lot of that has to do with price. Obviously, availability is also a thing. There's people who are sitting in different categories, and like what I was doing, right? I was into the independent bottlings and special releases and the occasional official bottling here and there. But there were conversations, there were a lot of people that I couldn't really have a very productive conversation with based on my choices and what they were choosing to drink or what they could or were willing to purchase. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on here. But what is my overall opinion, at least from the whiskeys I've tried? There's many more out there. There's more that I would love to grab a bottle of one of these days. My priorities obviously, change, and I'm probably moving on a little bit from this category, just kind of get back into some of the other things I was doing. But I guess my overall opinion on this category is I certainly didn't have any bad whiskey. I mean, if the worst thing was the Talisker, and I already knew that distillery was kind of, I had a rocky relationship with it to begin with. It was, I think, something that a lot of other whiskey drinkers have had some negative feelings about recently. You have to watch that video for my thoughts on that, but I certainly was not disappointed. And if anything, I was probably more surprised than anything at how much I enjoyed some of these whiskeys. There wasn't really anything that was a distinct disappointment. I said the Tomatin 18, maybe you could consider that, but not really. And I haven't really made up my final mind about these bottles yet. So that was great. In terms of the value proposition, we'll talk a lot more about that here in a second. I guess to sum that up, I didn't feel that any of them were particularly like great values. I think it ranged from like fair to good mostly. Obviously, some of the higher priced ones and like the Springbank and Long Row and things that you're paying, at least for, here in the States, where you either have to do auction or we're paying auction prices anyways. Those are, I think I said in the video, there's no way I can classify those as good values, because you can't. It doesn't matter how much I love them, the difference in price is pretty stark. So from a value proposition, I think it really overall just is going to depend on what you enjoy about Scotch. And I enjoy exploring and trying new things. So very few bottles, even if I don't really love them, are going to cause me a whole lot of heartache. Obviously, you don't want to make a habit of it, but everything's a learning point for me. It's filling in, checking off a box, however you want to say it, like something on the flavor spectrum. I'm just that much more informed with every bottle, regardless of whether it was my favorite in the world or even if it was something that maybe I didn't particularly like. Now, at the 18-year-old age statement and the price points, as I said, you don't want to make a habit of buying stuff you don't like there. And especially if you are someone who is only going to spend that much money like once a year, you really can't afford, quite literally, to buy something that you just straight up don't like. But whether you're going to dive into that 18-year-old or higher age statement range, you kind of got to know what Scotch you like, what you like about it, and you're going to have to be willing to take a risk, especially if you don't have a local bar or pub by you that offers those things. Yeah, I don't know how many of these bottles I'm going to replace regularly, even the ones I really, really like, right? There's just other things to try. I said at that price point, you have a lot of options. There's a lot of independent bottlings out there. There's a lot of special releases that come out these days. There's new distilleries popping up all the time. And there's just a lot of other things to try. And I don't think I've reached that point in my, so-called whiskey journey where I'm ready to just drink the same things all the time. We'll see if that day ever comes. But yeah, I guess that's my overall opinion. I really like the whiskeys. I thought the value proposition was generally fair-ish and probably no great values. I mean, good value within the category, sure, yes. But I'm talking about just not even the Scotch whiskey landscape, but whiskey in general globally. All right, so before we jump into the next one, why don't I actually take a little sip of these whiskeys here? Getting a little parched talking. So we'll do a little quick side-by-side, and we'll see if my opinion holds up there as well. Cheers. So that is my first sip of whiskey of the day. So getting a little bit accustomed to it. But I definitely think I like that more than I used to. Seems like the fruit pops up a little bit more. It's not so kind of distinctly just malty, a slight sherry influence. It's still a fairly malt forward whiskey, but yeah, I think kind of comparing it to the Glenmurray 18 is actually fairly accurate. I could pour some there. I'm not going to do that. I got enough to talk about here, but yeah, maybe kind of on that par with the Glenmurray 18, at least off of my memory. I had a glass of it not too long ago and still enjoyed it. But definitely not like knocking my socks off, but there's some good qualities here as well. All right, let's move on. Palate cleanse, and yeah, let's try the new one. Cheers. Yeah, a lot more expressive, obviously more sherry forward, just richer, more base. That sherry that is kind of bringing out some tropical fruits. There's some chocolate nuttiness. The finish is really good. It had a real nice viscous mouthfeel. I hope they bring this one back soon, and I hope it's still at least obtainable in terms of a price, and it's not going to make me feel bad if I really want to grab another one. Well, I definitely do. Sometimes it stinks when you have to feel bad about buying something that already know you really like. I think that's probably a big problem with some of the other 18-year-old whiskeys, especially for those of you that have been drinking this stuff for a long time. All right, so at least right now I'll take another sip later, but still preferring the new one. The old one was good, but yeah, the new Aaron 18 certainly takes it to another level. So let's get into a few other topics that kind of swirl around this, right? I've gone through the whiskeys. Again, you can learn a lot more about the process that or the thoughts that I had as I was going through it. I guess maybe one thing that I should say before we move on is if I were to re-review all of those, I'd probably have much different thoughts. Maybe scores would change slightly here or there, but especially some early on, right? I didn't have like as much perspective as I do now, and even right now, it's probably fairly limited. So if you do go back and you watch all of those, you kind of got to consider that even right now, as I'm sitting here, I probably acknowledge that I would say some different things and maybe even score the whiskeys a little differently. As I've went through these, there is a number of topics that just pop into my head as I was sitting here. Quietly, I think there are topics that I've pondered many times before, and that this whole exercise was something that filled in some gaps or gave me a little bit more data to crunch on those topics again. So let's start with one of those. And that's a pretty simple question. I think it's one that we've all kind of heard asked before, asked ourselves. But that is older specifically higher age stated Scotch whiskey or just whiskey in general better than whiskey that is younger than it? We've all been kind of bombarded in a lot of its marketing, right? That older whiskey is better. I remember some of those original videos that got me into Scotch whiskey, or at least put me, not just Scotch whiskey, but whiskey in general, that really pushed me from that casual drinker into like, oh, I absolutely love this. Were those videos that like the Whiskey Vault, or they were posted on the Whiskey Vault channel, and that they did with the Modern Rogue, where Rex and Daniel were basically teaching them how to, what the differences in whiskey were, how to smell whiskey, how to taste whiskey, what everything on the label meant, what the differences between Scotch and bourbon was, all this stuff. And those were the videos that like tipped me fully into the geekdom and cost me a lot of money over the last few years. This was back in 2019 when I watched those. And one of the questions that I'm pretty sure was brought up in one of those 3 videos, I believe there were 3 of them, was is older whiskey better? And the answer that they gave was that no, older whiskey is not necessarily better, but it is different, or it's just different. And at the time, especially, that was very reassuring. It's like, okay, I don't have to worry about that. I think my experience at that point probably echoed that, because I remember I bought a bottle of Macallan 18 way back when I first moved to California. And I got my first job here, and I was making California money, Bay Area money. And I went out and I bought a bottle of Macallan 18. And back then it was over $200 for that. Now they're 2 or 3 times, depending on which version you get. And I hated it. I was like, no, I still hate Macallan whiskey. I had always kind of thought that I didn't like Macallan. Now, obviously that was for different reasons that I may not like it now. It just didn't taste good. It tasted like whiskey burned. The whole thing. So that was a rough $200+ I spent on that bottle, but I certainly didn't see how older whiskey was better at that point in time. But I guess my experience over the years has changed that opinion, and that yes, generally speaking, when it comes to Scotch at least, older whiskey is better. Sometimes, like in bourbon, depending on how much you like the oak qualities and things, sometimes it's older is better up to a point, and then it's too much this, too much that, too much oak in part. Usually I would say that older whiskey definitely has a higher ceiling, and that's nothing that is not meant to discount younger age stated whiskeys. The 10-12-year-old category, there are tremendous things, whether they're core range or independent bottlings or whatever. There have been even a few single-digit age statement whiskeys that have absolutely been fantastic and have been seminal points in my whiskey journey over the years. And I'm talking about Scotch in that case, since probably the majority of bourbons and ryes are single age stated whiskey. But yeah, generally speaking, I would have said, yeah, older whiskey is usually going to be better, but it really depends. Like I mentioned, like what you're looking for. Are you in the flavor chase portion of your journey? Are you looking for new and exciting flavors, in which old whiskey can tend to provide? It can provide different flavors You start getting the leather and tobacco and the real dark, rich things, or the fruitiness just changes in so many of the whiskeys. The types of fruit that you can get, overripe, uh, dirty, tropical, like just the whole thing. It changes over time, and experience can tell you that. So I don't know if this exercise has completely changed that opinion. Actually, I don't think it's changed it very much. Generally speaking, when I was able to compare like the Deanston 12 and the Deanston 18, whether I did it on a video or not, I did that with the Lechik, the Port Charlotte, let's see, even like the Bruichladdich, although those are very, very different whiskeys, as are the Port Charlottes. Sometimes it's not fair to compare them because they're just completely different cask makeups. But yeah, generally I enjoyed the older age-dated version of that more. Not that I didn't enjoy the younger one as well. Really, experience is going to tell you whether you care about older age-dated whiskeys or you care about them yet. And if I were you, if you're a beginner, get to know the younger stuff first. It's absolutely the right call. The worst thing you want to do is probably jump into the more expensive, older, age-stated stuff before you're ready. Don't get disappointed early. Don't let that kill your vibe. Don't feel bad about spending $150, $200 on something and you get home, like I did with that Macallan 18, and be like, I hate drinking this. Why did I do that? Make sure you're ready first, is what I'm saying. Maybe it is more so that it's not necessarily that they're better. They are just different. It's just that those differences are more exciting. They're fun. Like the super complex layers and things of flavors and how things are integrated. Maybe that's just where the excitement is for me, where I'm at right now. So maybe it'll come full circle, and I'll have a completely different opinion at some point in the future. But at least for right now, yeah, generally speaking, I enjoy a little bit of age when it comes to my Scotch anyways. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about this whole value proposition thing. Price to value equation. This is probably going to shape people's opinions on that question. Is older whiskey better? Because, well, maybe it is, but I'm not paying that much. It's not that much better. And just generally speaking, as prices are increasing everywhere, but there seems to be these chasms widening, primarily different age statements. How do we kind of look at these from a value perspective? So let's talk about a couple things. Generally speaking, I think that once you get up into that kind of $150, $200 price point, I don't know if value is really the best term to use. Now, value in and of itself isn't referring to whiskeys that only cost less than $100. You should be able to find quote-unquote value at any price point, technically speaking. And in order for you to really accurately assess value across an entire category or entire, like, the whiskey landscape in general, you have to have a pretty good breadth of knowledge and experience, in the sense that I've had a lot of like 10, 12-year-old introductory level whiskeys. I've had the kind of the 15 to 18 stuff, and I've had older things, because then you can kind of see where does the curve get too steep? Where is it still manageable? And generally speaking, where you, on a personal level, are willing to splurge on a thing that you just love, right? We're all going to be probably willing to spend a little bit more for that bottle we just absolutely love. Like, that's why I still have quite a few Springbanks on my shelf. Even living in the US and having to pay the higher prices, I know how much I love it, and I know I'm going to get my quote-unquote value out of it most of the time. Value isn't necessarily this really great word to use, because we really have to ask ourselves individually, what are we looking for from a bottle like that? I'm sure we all treat bottles differently, right? We have our special occasion bottles. We have our quote-unquote daily sippers. We have this range of bottles that we probably treat differently. When our good friends come over, we pull some of these out. When we've got people who maybe aren't as experienced, we have different things we pull out for that. The list goes on. So what are you looking for from your bottle at that price point? Do you need to be absolutely knocked backwards into your seat? Do you need tears to stream from your eyes at $150 a bottle? Okay. I mean, maybe that's probably asking a lot at that point, barring like very specific experiences or very specific releases or distilleries. It's tough. But when you're talking about value in comparison to things outside of the category, like a 12-year-old, is two 12-year-old bottles worth 118? Because we saw that correlation a lot, right? 2 times The 18 was twice the price of the 12, or in some cases even more. Some cases probably a little less. If you want quantity, right, you're always going to be better off buying the two 12-year-old bottles. If you want quality, well, now the equation gets a little bit better, because if the 12 is really good, it gets a little confusing. Like the Bunnahabhain 12, I could definitely see that some people would enjoy the 12 over the 18. The flavor differences are pretty distinct. In the UK, it's about twice the price or something like that of the bottle. In the US, it gets weird because, like I've mentioned, that Bunna 18 is $350, $400 plus tax here. So that kind of just gets thrown out the window. But you see what I'm saying, right? What do you want from your whiskey? Because, like I said, if you're looking for your whiskey to last you longer, like you need that $150 to keep your shelf with whiskey on it for a longer period of time, month, 2 months, whatever, you're going to pick up the two 12-year-old editions. If you've got enough and your shelf is already full, then yeah, maybe you're going to be more willing to pick up the 18 because you've got the budget for it. You were going to spend $150. Your shelf is already at capacity. So, hey, you're not going to run out of whiskey anytime soon. It's a little bit easier to justify maybe that one bottle that costs $150. And another just kind of random thought that I had, and I'm not going to give an answer to this, and maybe this will become a little more clear later in this whole spiel, but is a 12-year-old Scotch and an 18-year-old Scotch, are these actually different? These different things? Like, obviously they're Scotch, they're whiskey, but most people are probably treating those two bottles pretty differently. And so do we really almost have to look at them as almost different things? We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but probably not generally speaking. They're not that big of a difference, but it is something that maybe we should ask ourselves occasionally for different topics. So to kind of bring things back to what I was saying earlier, this idea of a value proposition is complex. I basically said that the majority of these 18-year-old bottles range from a value prospect from fair to poor, right? There weren't really anything that was really reaching too far into that good to great category. Now you can argue that it depends on your perspective, right? As I mentioned, if you're just looking at just 18-year-old whiskeys, then yeah, some are better values than others. Some will be great values. But if you're looking at it from a broader perspective, right, it's difficult. It can be difficult to justify, especially when you're putting a video out into the universe, telling other people whether they should go buy it. Like, if you think something is great value that I think is poor value, that doesn't mean I think you should stop buying it. You should absolutely buy what you want. But the reality is at those price points, as I mentioned, there's a lot of options. So you can't really just compare it to core range 18-year-old releases, because there's a lot of independent bottlings, regardless of the age statement. Like I said, there's special releases regardless of the age statement. You know, there's different styles of whiskey from different places in the world. When you get to that price point, hell, you can buy things that aren't whiskey. That exists too. So anyways, I think that's where a lot of people are coming from, because they're looking at it like, man, I can buy so many different things for this amount. These bottles really have to justify themselves. Now, some of it's availability, like I mentioned, but there's no doubt that there's a lot of really good whiskey at this price point, at this age statement range. But there's good whiskey in other areas as well. And I think one thing that you need to consider when thinking about how you value things is, what's your criteria for being disappointed, right? I kind of mentioned earlier this idea of like what you enjoy about Scotch and what motivates you to drink this and to spend any money on this at all. But I think it's a question that, when it popped into my head, kind of made me stop for a second. I'm like, wow, what if, it just doesn't taste good? You know, not every bottle that I don't like is necessarily like, yeah, that's disappointing, as I mentioned, but my heart's not necessarily broken. I can still get value out of it. I can still learn something, provided that it's not utterly undrinkable, which I didn't think was possible until maybe recently. But people are going to be disappointed for different reasons. Again, if you can only buy one bottle a year at $150 plus, I can totally understand being pretty mad. If you come home and you pour it and you're like, what is this? This is terrible. What are you going to do? Can't return it. So yeah, I can definitely understand that. But so everyone's going to have to answer that for themselves, and I can't answer that for you. Again, for me, to be disappointed, I just have to feel like I've been completely bamboozled, completely misled, and there's no redeeming value. Because even if I've spent a good amount of money and I just don't like it, at least I can spend the bottle trying to figure out why. And that can educate my decisions going forward. So maybe just to wrap up, value and subjectivity. I wrote about this on my blog a bit, I think. It's definitely something I've thought about, but how subjective value is. And in fact, I've always kind of said that I think if you really boil it down, value is more subjective even than taste. And just that's a complex idea that I had. But generally speaking, I think we are all more capable of sharing flavors. Right? It's why you watch YouTube channels and reviews and things. Like you're looking for you trust someone else's opinion. And you're obviously looking for their opinion on value as well, but it's a lot easier to communicate like what something tastes like. And if I don't understand what you're talking about, I can probably find it in 2024. At least, here in the States, some things are hard to get from certain areas of the world, but I can probably track it down, provided it's not illegal to import or something like that. But yeah, we can go out and we're going to have different opinions on things, but we can communicate what things taste like. But if I'm going to try to explain to someone who doesn't know me personally how I value money, how I value objects, retirement, just anything that money and possessions and things go, like that's a super for you to fully understand why I'm comfortable spending X amount of dollars on a bottle of whiskey. You may have had a completely different upbringing, a completely different cultural experience, a completely different, and getting over that barrier could be impossible in some cases. Like there could absolutely be a chasm there where people could look at decisions that I've made or, good or bad and said, no, I just can never possibly understand why you would think that was a quote unquote good value. Or why you think that what I thought was a good value is a poor decision or something like that. That's very, very difficult to convey without just spending hours together, just have in the deepest types of conversations. Like the things that happened in my life that affect how I value certain things, I might not fully even understand it myself. So that's kind of my opinion about that. I know it's a little deep, maybe a little ridiculous, but I think it's true. I think it is true. Why people are willing to do things when it comes to finances and how we spend our time and even the empty calories involved in whiskey drinking and that sort of thing. It's complex. Another point of subjectivity in value comes from that value isn't always related to the drinking experience. And some of us may hate that, right? Some people have value in investments, collecting, flipping, which is no type of investment, right? Some people can find value in just stopping the FOMO. FOMO seems to be a dirty word kind of in the whiskey community, this fear of missing out. And there have absolutely been times where, more so maybe in bourbon, I just want to know if I should keep caring about this. So maybe I will pay a little more the first time just to stop that. Or at least I'm more confident in whether it's worth it. Other people can put value in a bottle purchase from a social perspective, social media, sharing it with friends, taking it to a whiskey group, trying to impress people, and whatever it is, make sure they invite you back, sort of thing. Bring something nice. But you can put value in it from that perspective, and it's just super subjective. Like you can have a million different reasons why you can value something. It's not always about how good the whiskey is. And at the end of the day, I think what I'll just tack on to that without going into a whole nother subject, a whole nother rant, but that's whatever your reason is. Even if I think, that's not the way I would have done it, but don't apologize for buying what you buy and don't apologize for drinking what you drink. You don't have to justify it to anyone else. Sometimes online, you see people kind of demand other people justify to them why they've made the decision. You don't have to do that. Just enjoy yourself. That's something I even sometimes when I see something that kind of irks me, it's what kind of always brings me back. And that's just, it's their money, it's their journey, it's their time. Even though it can be frustrating, there's always something else. I've never run out of things to enjoy. So that's my approach. But I want to move into something else, maybe a completely different topic now. Before I do that, take another sip of these whiskeys. Let's give these one more try. So that was the old Aaron 18. I have to say that sip was pretty good. It's kind of this real fruity, bready, like a bread with some marmalade, honey. Yeah, toasted bread. Not super like sharp citrus, but yeah, more like a marmalade. Almost a little bit more of a candied citrus. That's actually, it's pretty nice. But I still think this new one is probably going to trump it just slightly. Here we go. Cheers. There is just a lot more like evolution. It's more full flavored. And I think I can kind of pick out maybe some of the some of the fruit similarities. Now that the old one kind of opened up a little bit more. It's been in this sample jar for probably quite a while. I think the gap closed slightly. I still think the new 18 is more full. There's more richness there from that sherry. Definitely something I think is going to be way more of a crowd pleaser. But that the old version definitely does have some redeeming values to it. And I think maybe what I'll do is I will grab this Deanston 18. Again, this is the old version of the Deanston 18. I'm not going to do a side by side because I don't want to drink any more than this. But I am going to pour just a little bit from here and try it. This probably came from Kevin, my podcast co-host here most of the time. Probably sent this to me probably a long time ago now. Smells a lot different than the new Deanston 18. I'll tell you that much. All right, let's let that open up and get back to it. So coming off this like value discussion, and we're definitely diverging from just that 18-year-old core range conversation at this point. We'll bring it back full circle here in a minute. But I think one of the tangential conversations to have with these increasing prices and with this the 18-year-old Scotch category being where that curve, as I mentioned before, is really starting to steepen. What I hear from the other creators and from just people making comments on Facebook groups, Reddit posts, whatever, that morality in pricing in particular is a pretty regular conversation. Sometimes from a judgmental perspective, sometimes maybe from a more philosophical perspective. And, when I said just drink what you want, buy what you want, right? There's some people that do feel that there's a morality in all of this, both from a distillery standpoint and from a consumer standpoint. And I think sometimes with a lot of the philosophical conversation. So a lot of the times when people sit around and they philosophize, right, nothing's going to change based on their conversation. It just can maybe help some other people who are exposed to that approach life in a different way than maybe they would have otherwise. So one thing that I've noticed a lot in both watching whiskey creators online or being a part of like online groups, Facebook groups, Reddit subreddits, whatever, is basically there's the question of morality comes up pretty frequently. And we're talking about the morality of distilleries and their ownership groups, the morality of consumers and what they buy and what they do with their bottles of whiskey after they buy them. And there's a lot of frustration around all of that and people having different objectives in all of this. So let's talk about that for a little bit, because again, with this price inflection point, this separating, it's creating maybe a bit of a gap in the community. I do think this is relevant to the conversation because, especially with people having loved some of these 18-year-old single malts prior, they were more affordable, obtainable, available. All that's changing to some degree. You can hear some of their very understandable frustration in that. Let's talk about distilleries first and the morality of distilleries, and particularly their distillery owners in many cases. There was a quote that I heard another creator say. I'm not criticizing this person by any stretch of the imagination, and it's a channel that comes up here pretty frequently, at least on the podcast, and that's the Aquavite channel with the VPub. It's one of the videos that I make sure I don't miss most weeks. I think I have to catch up on last week's, but life happens. And really respect what Roy's done. Big reason why I'm here today. Don't always agree with this or that, but that's cool. Doesn't bother me most of the time. Occasionally I get a little riled up, but that's okay. That's what makes things fun, right? But there was a statement that he kind of said about this. He talks about pricing a lot, value a lot, and he's said this a couple times, and that is that just because you can charge something doesn't mean that you should charge that, implying that there's some morality to what things are priced at, and that these companies and businesses, for good reasons possibly, should forego profit today for maybe some goodwill tomorrow, that sort of thing. And when I first heard him say that, It made a lot of sense. It felt good. Like, yeah, screw these greedy companies. But I thought about it a little bit more. The next immediate thought in my head that popped up was, but that's a really idealistic perspective given the world today, particularly meaning kind of the West, Europe, North America, that sort of thing. You know, our system of governments and economic systems and that sort of thing, kind of for better or worse. And I don't want to make this a political podcast at all. Please keep the comments whiskey focused. But yeah, it's kind of, it is what it is, right? It's not a comment for or against it. It's just, it is what it is. We live in a situation where there are these things called publicly traded companies, publicly owned companies, where there are shareholders. And when it comes to the Scotch whiskey industry, excuse me, right, you're mostly talking about Diageo and Pernod Ricard. And these are big companies, right? I have a note here, and I should have clarified. I did a poor job. I didn't cite this, but I did some calculation, or maybe I read it somewhere. But 63% of Scotch is sold by basically publicly owned companies, and I don't know if that's true. I did a poor job of note taking there, but Diageo and Pernod Ricard own a ton of Scotch distilleries, and obviously the brands that those distilleries make up, like Johnny Walker. And these are corporations. I mean, as Ralphie would say, these are multinational corporations. And he's right. These aren't Scotch distilleries, or these aren't Scotch companies, Scottish companies, sorry. And when you're publicly traded, your responsibility is almost solely to your shareholders. It's not really a responsibility to the consumers outside of you need your consumers to keep buying your stuff so that your shareholders are happy. And yeah, that it's the economics of a good chunk of the world today. And even if it's not, even if you're in a country that maybe does things a little bit differently, you're certainly impacted by it. Like if you're trying to do business with North America or Europe, right, and even large swaths of the rest of the world, you're dealing with a capitalist system. So when you're dealing with corporations where their primary responsibility is to their shareholders, obviously they have to operate within the regulations of the countries that they're doing business in, and they need to keep their customers happy to some degree, right? Because it's pretty important that people keep paying for your stuff, otherwise your profits aren't going up. Yeah, outside of that, think of it this way. This is a very complex equation. I'm going to oversimplify it, but stick with me. If you're the CEO of a large company that made, in 2023, they made $100 million, pounds, whatever. And in 2024, all things being equal, you also profited $100 million, pounds, whatever. You failed. Your job is at risk at this point. A, you didn't even keep up with inflation, but B, your shareholders want the stock price to go up. That's why they're investors. They're not giving you their money so you can, just hold on to it for them. They want more as time goes on. And if that becomes too much of a problem, the board of directors are going to get rid of the CEO and all the executives if they don't start making more money. Now, again, it's complex, right? There's acquisitions and investments and paying off debts and that sort of thing that affect the equation of that. But generally speaking, the CEO of Diageo needs to say, well, how do we make more money this year than we made last year? Because if we don't, a lot of us are going to be out of jobs. Doesn't mean if we made $100 million and everybody gets to keep their job, I might not. And that stinks because it makes companies do weird decisions. People get laid off so that the company is more profitable. Even if the company was already profitable, people get laid off all the time right after, record earnings were reported. But so when you have a company like Diageo and you say, well, just because you can charge that doesn't mean you should. That is definitely not what they're thinking. They are definitely not thinking that. Corporations are generally pretty short-sighted. That's why we have economic crashes. That's why we have housing crashes. That's why this stuff happens. If people cared about the future, it could be avoided, but people are greedy today. Yeah, you can write them as many angry letters as you want, as Kevin and I joked in the last episode here. But yeah, if 63% of Scotch is not owned by Scottish companies, are not owned by people who give a damn, because obviously, Roy, with this quote, I skipped right over this, but he obviously has some degree of Scottish pride Obviously, Scotch whiskey being like a real big contributing factor to the rest of the world being aware of this pretty small little island country, outside of being part of just the UK in general, probably gets kind of lost in the mix to some degree, for at least for some people. So I can definitely see having like a stronger. It's got to be real frustrating for these companies that don't care about the fact that of Scottish heritage. I mean, they'll leverage it when it works for them, but there's some pretty harsh realities that through whatever process, all of these international, just massive companies came to own all of these distilleries. It's creating some issues for sure. But even some of these new, more independently owned distilleries still have shareholders. They have investors, maybe like private equity type investors, just private investors, personal relationship sort of thing. But they have expectations too. They want returns. They're not just lending you their money for if it's the private type of private equity agreement or investment that I'm familiar with. That money's locked up for years with an expectation that you're going to get paid back at a certain point, and then some percentage of the profits, essentially. So even they have responsibilities to people for their very existence that they have to pay back. So unless this was a privately financed endeavor, which very few of them are, usually almost all of them probably take out some form of a loan at the very least. So almost everybody. You have like J&A Mitchell and Springbank and Kilkerran, who more run like a family type distillery, and they're allowed to operate to the benefit of their community and the benefit of the distillery and to the benefit of Scotch whiskey as a whole. And we should definitely be happy that we have an example. We have some new distilleries that are at least taking up some of that approach for as much as is reasonable for a new distillery. You just try to open another Springbank, that's probably a pretty big risk. But because if you can't manage to produce Springbank quality whiskey, but to kind of tie that back into this cultural responsibility and respecting Scotland and its history and what whiskey was, and it was a drink, it was a drink for the populace, and this wasn't some hoity-toity thing. This came from the illicit distills of the Highlands and the Lowlands and everywhere in between. Cultural responsibility to Diageo only comes if it protects future profits, and that's only part of the calculation, because they're always going to be focused more on this year than they are 10 years from now, because that's how they keep their job this year. They're very well paid job. But from a consumer perspective, let's flip it around a little bit, right? You see, the morality is asked of consumers. One statement that you will hear is, well, if people keep buying it at that price, then there's no incentive for the distilleries to change. And maybe like it's a complex equation again. But here's the thing, you're never going to get everybody to behave the same way. So making that statement is like, well, yeah, but you can say that about anything. Like, people are complaining that McDonald's Big Mac meals cost $15 or something now, which is absurd. We'll see what happens with that. But I mean, how many people are be like, man, I really need to eat something. I've got like 10 minutes and there's a McDonald's right there. Am I not going to swing by and to grab a Big Mac? Some people won't, but a lot of people are still going to do that. And the kids want to go there. There's a lot of reasons why people will make exceptions to their rule. But, for me, it's like, yeah, I've been a quote unquote part of the problem before, but people were mad at the price of the new Bruichladdich 18 and Port Charlotte 18, but I knew that those were things I really, really wanted. So unless it was just utterly absurd, I was probably going to get one. So it is what it is. Am I part of the problem? Yeah, maybe. People are going to buy what they want. People value things for different reasons. So asking consumers as a whole, especially when you're talking globally, people can't agree on anything. So don't tell me how to spend my money. Yeah, maybe one day the investors and the flippers will eat it and suffer the consequences for their greed. But hey, when that day comes, then everyone can celebrate. But up until that point comes, like, until something changes, it's definitely not going to be a focus of my channel. Buy what you want. I try not to regret my whiskey purchases, as I mentioned earlier. again, we're all just going to have to buy what we want, buy what we can afford, buy what we can justify, and try to enjoy that as much as possible. And the market over time will fluctuate. As I've always said, try not to get mad about whiskey. It should be fun. It should be enjoyable. So the morality equation, the morality question is probably not something that we can force. Just like philosophers sitting around and debating an issue that the people who actually are going to make the decision aren't even going to hear that debate. So individually, we all just have to make those choices for ourselves. So let's bring this back to the 18-year-old core range category. Start wrapping things up here. So a few just lessons learned, I think, outside of that. From a value perspective, the 2 times price, does 2 times the price mean 2 times better question, the value equation, like, you got to throw that stuff out. If you're buying whiskeys at these price points and these age statements, hopefully you have the experience to understand what you're doing and knowing why, and understand what you're getting out of it, understand what's going to disappoint you about it, and coming to peace with that, so to speak. If you're really stretching your budget to pick up a bottle like that, know what you're doing first. Make sure that you've tasted it. Make sure that you know. Because if you can't afford to be disappointed, then don't put yourself in that position. Another thought that came out of all of this is that the 18-year-old age statement in and of itself is an anomaly. There aren't a ton of other options globally available. Some people don't like bourbon. Once it gets to that kind of 15, 18-year-old age statement, they find it to be too oaky. Depends on the distillery, depends on the release. Obviously, Japanese whiskey that's 18 years old is so incredibly expensive. 18-year-old Scotch is an absolute bargain compared to that. Obviously, there's some countries where, similar to maybe, at least parts of the U.S., you can't leave something in oak for 18 years. It'll be too oaky. Some of the hotter climates. I wonder if we'll ever see an 18-year-old Texas whiskey. That'd be interesting. I wonder how dead the cask would have to be. But yeah, 18-year-old age statements are almost a bit of a monopoly in some ways with Scotch whiskey. So there's not someone else producing whiskey that is that same quality and is cheaper. So 18-year-old bourbon is pretty pricey. Even the stuff that isn't highly sought after. Elijah Craig, that's over $150. Knob Creek 18 is another one that you can find. That's under $200. So you can find them. I got a 17-year-old George Dickel for like $60. Although it's very different. A lot of people don't like George Dickel. This is the first bottle I bought. And it is definitely a little different, but we'll see. Haven't made up my mind yet. Yeah, there's really no competition at this age statement. So there's nothing kind of holding things down. Hopefully maybe someday. And then maybe Scotch will be back to just relying on its marketing. But at least to justify that price, or maybe it'll have to stay still, or maybe everybody just sees that, well, that's what they're selling Scotch for. That's what I can sell mine for. And that's probably a big mistake. Don't do that. But it is a monopoly for the most part. So you have to kind of keep that in mind as well. I'd hate to be a new drinker now. There's so many options, and the pricing just doesn't make sense. Special releases, just all the new distilleries, crazy cask types. People, sometimes you wonder if that's even because they want to use that type of cask. Sometimes you wonder if that's just the cask they can buy. I don't know. If you're a brand new drinker trying to get into whiskey right now, it feels like, man, there's some minefield out there. It's confusing as hell. I'm not sure I fully grasp it. But in terms of how I'm going to plan on talking about whiskeys that are this age statement or this price point or whatever, I'm going to talk about them like every other bottle. I kind of mentioned earlier, like, is this a completely different drink when you're seeing these price differences? Maybe at some point, yes. I don't know if the 18-year-old Scotch category is quite distanced itself. Hopefully things calm down and things stabilize at least. Because if they keep going, then yeah, even I'm going to tap out. And it's like, absolutely not. I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to talk about them like they're any other whiskey. I'm going to value them like they're any other whiskey, and we're going to kind of have to address those as they come. Generally speaking, I'll probably still focus a lot, for at least on a personal level, on like independent bottlings. That's still where bread and butter is. It's still where I think probably, generally speaking, money is best spent, although that's getting more murky by the year as well, in terms of, you know, they used to be a pretty good value at times. Now they still can be. Depends on the name on the front, which is weird because the name on the front on an independent bottling doesn't mean that the whiskey in the bottle is going to be anything like what got the name on the front, the recognition in the first place. It's a little strange, but I get it. You know, it's another one of those things that's not going to make sense, but it's going to be the way that it is. And I'm probably not going to run out to buy a whole lot more 18-year-old official bottlings right now. There's a few that I would love to try. Probably just not there yet with them. I can name for sure, like the Loch Lomond 18 is one I'd like to grab a bottle of at some point. The Old Pulteney 18 is another one. I've been drinking a little bit more Old Pulteney lately. I know the current version of Old Pulteney is not necessarily viewed as highly as maybe as it once was. I'd still like to try it. You know, again, point of education, something that I can talk about intelligently when it comes to the channel. And yeah, other than that, I think I probably tried most of the ones that were immediately on my mind. I'm sure there's probably some other ones out there that I'm forgetting. But speaking of which, why don't we talk about this Deanston 18 that I've had sitting in front of me? Just do a quick little nosing and tasting of this. Definitely love this. Is why I like keeping my little sample collection. When the mood strikes and you have something kind of cool to expand upon an experience. That's why I recommend doing this rather than an infinity bottle, because you can always still make an infinity bottle. The only downside is it's way more space inefficient, because you just have boxes of these 1 to 2 ounce Boston round bottlings. I've got a label on them. I have maybe a couple hundred of them now, maybe 150. I don't know. I have quite a few. At least with the channel, it's giving me more of a reason to dip into them here and there. But yeah, let's check out this old version of Deanston 18, which, as far as I heard, was not nearly as good as the new version. So there's still some Deanston character in here. You're getting that kind of malty, slightly waxy, not like Kleinlish waxy, but it's kind of leaning that direction. Some darker honey. It does seem kind of simple. I think it's not nearly as bright, kind of fresh as the new Deanston 18. Definitely feel like I like the nose on the new version better, but try it on the palate. Cheers. There's some interesting qualities to that. There's some good things. A little bit of a sharpness, a little bit of a bitterness kind of coming out of the finish. Yeah, I think I definitely like the new Deanston 18 a little bit better than this. This feels a little bit rougher around the edges. I definitely would not think that this was an 18-year-old whiskey. I wonder if the casks were maybe kind of rough. Seems a little spirity, especially for an 18-year-old, but also slightly like over oaked or something. I don't know. It's strange. It's a strange combination of things. Another sip, maybe the second one will be a little more clear. Maybe not quite as sharp down the middle. There's a flatness to it, and like kind of weirdly like burnt, like the malt was burnt or something. It's not terrible, but I think coming off of these two Aaron 18s and knowing what the Deanston 18 was, yeah, this is definitely not my favorite of the bunch. Maybe it's something I just would need to get used to, but at least for right now, sitting here today off the top of my head, not terrible, but there's some weirdness going on, and it seems there's something off about it. Anyway, ultimately, so have my opinions changed? Let's get back to this 18-year-old core range conversation. Have my opinions changed about whiskey in general? Not necessarily. I think if anything, it probably confirmed what I thought was probably the case, and that is, yeah, the 18-year-old Scotch category, especially if you're looking at those 46% or higher non-chill filtered, that's still some pretty darn good whiskey. There's no getting around that. There's some really, really nice whiskey. You understand, why Scotch, especially Scotch single malt, has garnered the reputation that it has over the last 30, 40 years. it's all there, and it's good to see some distilleries like Decent 18 change for the better. I know there have been a few that people feel have changed for the worse, but Aaron changed for the better. There are distilleries out there taking this stuff seriously and trying to put out their best product they can, and that's very reassuring. It's just whether or not people can continue to afford them, and you want as many people to be able to share in it. You want the community to be, you don't want it to be segmented. You want to be able to have as many people as possible sharing in the conversation, I think. I don't think we should be greedy. I don't think it should be an exclusive club, but I do definitely feel more comfortable maybe talking about this. There's so much more to learn, and I just need to get further into these bottles. And so maybe in a year, if I remember, or if one of you remember, I should do maybe a quick update video. What am I thinking about this whole thing? It's a pretty seminal moment in the channel and just in my whiskey experience. So it might be good to kind of check back in on what I was thinking a year ago. But maybe in some ways I am just as, if not more, unsure of myself, because what I think today might be like, it might not be up to me. The industry and the global economy, like, who knows? Things are weird, as I've said before, but I think at the end of the day, our journeys are our own. They are definitely our own. And reaching out and listening to people with YouTube channels or podcasts or reading blogs or joining whiskey groups and just hearing other people talk, I think that's good. But we do, at the end of the day, have to follow our own constraints, whether those are self-imposed or they're imposed by circumstances beyond our control or whatever. And generally speaking, I think, my opinion, that we should all explore as much as possible within those constraints, and don't get too settled in. Be afraid to buy something that maybe you don't like at first. Try to get used to new flavors, that sort of thing, whether it's within whiskey or a different category. The more breadth of options you have, the more you can mitigate rising prices and reduced availability and that sort of thing. If there's always something else on the shelf, whether it's the whiskey shelf or not, you can find something pretty good. There's good stuff everywhere. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers it. Like I said, I think some of these topics could just be their own episode. And obviously just trying to keep things at least relatively concise, and we'll see what kind of editing I have to do. I'm excited to continue. I don't know exactly what's next. We'll try some new things over the summer, but thank you everybody who's been tuning in. Thank you everyone who followed this whole series and has been giving me advice and encouragement through the comments and thumbs up and subscriptions. It's always great. Thank you again if you are listening on one of the podcast networks. Yeah, let me know what you want to see next. Let me know if there's something else you'd love to see me do. Can't promise I'd do it. I did post a video on my YouTube kind of soliciting advice. Didn't get a ton of comments, but I'm not surprised by. But there were the ones that were left. I think definitely there were some good ideas in there. So definitely give me something to think about. But it's possible that maybe over the next week or two, it will just be one video a week. Just let me catch my breath a little bit after all of this, and really kind of contemplate something fun to do next. So until then, again, thank you all so much. I really appreciate this. This has been a ton of fun. Until next time, cheers.